Out on the open plains, cattle drives could last for months. Cowboys covering thousands of miles through blistering heat, dust storms, and freezing nights. But how do you keep food from spoiling without refrigeration, ice, or grocery stores for hundreds of miles? How do the cooks manage to feed hungry cowboys day after day without anyone getting sick? Let's saddle up and discover the clever, surprising ways chuck wagon cooks kept food fresh. Back in 1866, a Texas rancher named Charles Goodnight came up with a clever idea that changed life on the trail forever. Cowboy cattle drives were long, often 3 to 6 months, and could stretch over 1,000 miles, all the way from Texas ranches up to railroad towns like Abilene, Kansas. Goodnight knew keeping his cowboys well fed was just as important as having good horses, so he decided to turn an old army wagon into a mobile kitchen. That's how the chuck wagon was born. The chuck wagon was a small kitchen on wheels. Since cowboys called their meals chuck, an old English word for hearty, satisfying food, it made perfect sense to name the mobile kitchen the chuck wagon. The idea caught on fast. Before long, companies like Studebaker began manufacturing ready-made chuck wagons, selling them for what then was a steep price, around $100. The golden era of cattle drives lasted roughly 20 years, peaking in the 1880s. During that time, many ranchers made their fortunes. But even after the big drives faded, old photos show cowboys gathered around chuck wagons, still cooking and eating out on the range well into the 1930s. Goodnight added a big wooden box on the back with shelves and drawers to hold supplies like flour, beans, sugar, and coffee. The box had a hinged door that could fold down flat, turning into a handy work table for food prep. This setup was nicknamed the chuck box, and it quickly became the heart of every cattle drive. Goodnight thought of everything. Heavy pots, cast iron skillets, and Dutch ovens were tucked away in a section underneath called the boot, so they stayed safe on bumpy trails. Even the work surface was covered with copper sheets because copper naturally killed germs. This was an early clever way of keeping food safe long before modern sanitizers. The chuck wagon made sure cowboys could eat hearty, hot meals like stews, biscuits, beans, and coffee every day, no matter where they were. Kept them going through tough conditions and created a sense of home on the trail. While the cowboys took turns watching the herd overnight, the chuck cook got to sleep, but not for long. His day began in the dark, usually around 3 a.m. when most of the crew was still snoring in their bedrolls. First, he'd grind the coffee beans and get a fire going. That coffee pot, it had to be brewing before the first cowboy even stretched. Once the fire roared, Cookie got busy heating up his heavy Dutch ovens. He had no room for mistakes. If breakfast wasn't ready on time, his reputation was on the line. Cowboys might never insult the cook to his face, but if the food was later cold, he'd hear about it eventually. He'd slap beef fat into the hot pots, salt steaks, and shake biscuit dough, dipping each in tallow before baking them in a coal-covered oven trench. When it was time to eat, he'd shout, "Chuck's ready!" and the men would line up with 10 plates, grabbing a spot on the ground or a nearby log to dig in. After breakfast, while the crew hit the trail, Cookie cleaned up, packed the wagon, and moved ahead to scout the next lunch stop, always keeping an eye out for kindling to stash in the possum belly under the wagon. Lunch was quick, but dinner was where the cook shined. If he had the supplies, or was just in a good mood, he might trade salted beef for a stew or even bake a dried fruit pie. In the evening, while cowboys sang or swapped stories, Cookie was still preparing for tomorrow's breakfast. He was more than just the cook. He was the planner, the provider, and often the soul of the camp. When Cookie finally rolled into his bedroll, he'd already be thinking about the next fire, the next meal, and the next long day on the trail. You see, long before refrigerators, pioneers had to find simple ways to keep food from spoiling. One of the most common and important techniques was drying, sometimes also called dehydration. Native Americans had already perfected this method before European settlers arrived. They would cut strips of meat like buffalo, elk, or rabbit and hang them up in the sun to dry. This pulled out the moisture and kept the meat safe to eat for a long time. When pioneers set out across the frontier, they borrowed this practice because it was so easy and didn't need special equipment. They'd hang meat near a campfire so the heat and smoke would dry it faster. The smoke also gave the meat a nice flavor, and added an extra layer of protection against bugs and bacteria. Other times, they'd just lay fruits or vegetables outside on a warm day and let the sun do the work. This drying process was super practical. Dried meat, often called jerky, was lightweight and took up very little space, making it ideal for long trips where wagons could only carry so much. Plus, it lasted for months without spoiling. They also dried fruits like apples, peaches, and berries. They'd cut them into slices and leave them out on racks or blankets until they shriveled up and were safe to store. Salt was also a hero of the Old West. Long before cowboys and pioneers crossed the plains, people around the world had been using salt to preserve food. Salt draws water out of meat, creating an environment where bacteria and parasites can't survive. On long drives, cowboys would often eat salt pork, fat pork belly pieces that were packed in coarse salt to cure. This was a straightforward process. Rub the pork all over with salt, about 3 to 4% of its weight. Layer the pieces in containers and make sure every surface was covered. This way, meat stayed good for months without refrigeration. Before cooking, cowboys soaked the pork in water to draw the extra salt out so it was easier to eat. Smoking was another popular way to preserve meat on the frontier. Smokehouses could be found all over the Old West because smoking meat added flavor and kept it from spoiling. The process was fairly simple. Meat was hung up in a small structure where a slow, smoky fire would burn for hours. The smoke left behind chemicals that killed bacteria and gave the meat a tasty, smoky flavor. Even better, this method also pulled moisture from the meat, which helped it last much longer. Smoking was often combined with salt curing to make sure food stayed safe in harsh conditions. Together, salt and smoke gave pioneers a way to store food that could last all the way to the next town or the next season. When cowboys set off on those long, dusty cattle drives, they needed food that could last for months without spoiling. The chuck wagon was like a mobile pantry, carrying supplies that could hold up in rough conditions. But what was in this little kitchen on wheels? Well, mostly dried staples like beans, dried meat, dried fruits, and coffee beans. Another big part of the diet was something called hardtack, which was basically a super tough cracker made of flour, water, and salt. Hardtack was easy to store and wouldn't go bad, but it was also hard as a rock. Cowboys usually had to soak it in coffee or toss chunks into a stew to soften it up before they could eat it. This simple food might not sound like much, but it kept the cowboys going. They worked long days in the saddle, so every meal was important. Dried beans gave them protein, dried meat kept them full, and dried fruits added some sweetness. Every item was picked for its staying power. Cooks had to make sure nothing spoiled too quickly because there were no grocery stores along the trail. The chuck wagon was truly the heart of camp life. When the day was over and everyone gathered around the fire, a simple meal could mean the world. Even though trail food was plain and tough, it brought everyone together and kept them fueled for whatever the next day would bring. But if there was one thing that kept the cowboys going, it was coffee. On those long trail drives, a hot cup of coffee was more than just a drink. It was a daily ritual that brought everyone together. Every morning before sunrise and every night after a long day in the saddle, the chuck wagon cook would get the coffee going. Making trail coffee was simple. First, the cook would fill a big pot with water, leaving a little room at the top. Then they'd dump in coffee grounds. No fancy machines, no filters, just beans straight into the pot. After letting the water boil for a few minutes, the cook would pour a bit of cold water into the pot to help the coffee grounds sink to the bottom. This method created a strong, dark brew that could just about stand a spoon up straight. Cowboys liked their coffee bold and bitter because they needed the kick. Usually, the cook relied on Arbuckle beans, which were one of the most popular brands back then. Every quart of water would need a quarter cup of grounds to make it strong enough. But when cowboys and pioneers hit the trail, beans were one of the most important foods they carried. Why? Because dried beans are full of protein and last for a long time. Perfect for a trip that could stretch into months. Packed into sacks and raised off the floor to keep them dry and safe from pests, they were like a dependable pantry that never went bad. Beans could be turned into all kinds of meals. They weren't just a side dish. They were often the main event. On the trail, beans kept everyone full and fueled up, especially during long stretches without meat. But they also took some planning. Before cooking them, beans had to soak overnight. Otherwise, they'd take forever to soften up over the fire. Chuck Wagon Cook would usually get up early and start big pots of beans in Dutch ovens. They'd add whatever they had on hand, salt pork, bacon drippings, or simple seasonings, then let them slowly simmer for hours. By the time the Cowboys rolled into camp, the beans were tender and tasty, a perfect warm meal after a hard day in the saddle. Even though they were simple, beans were a trail hero. Easy to store, easy to make in big batches, and packed with energy. They kept the crew going mile after mile. Now, if you want to talk about real trail power food, pemmican was it. Adopted from the recipes of Native Americans, pemmican was a super concentrated food that lasted for months. It was made by drying meat, often buffalo or deer, and then pounding it into tiny pieces. Next, they'd add rendered fat and sometimes dried berries. When all of that was mixed together, it created a dense, rich food that was surprisingly tasty and loaded with energy. Pemmican was incredibly lightweight, so it was easy to pack and carry. Plus, the mix of protein, fat, and carbs gave cowboys or travelers exactly what they needed to keep going all day. Even a small bit could fill you up. That's why pemmican was one of the most valuable trail foods, especially when hunting was impossible or other supplies ran low. Fresh bread was one of the greatest luxuries on the trail, and sourdough starters made it possible. But keeping that starter alive took some skill. The starter, a mixture of flour and water that attracted wild yeast, had to be cared for like a pet. Chuck Wagon cooks kept their starters in glass or crock jars, often wrapped in damp towels and tucked into the pantry box where the temperature stayed even. On cold nights, the cook might even carry the jar close to their body just to keep it warm enough for the yeast to work its magic. Every few days, the starter had to be fed with a bit of flour and water to stay active. If it was sealed too tightly, it could go bad because yeast needs air to breathe. But when it was handled right, that jar of starter gave the crew a regular supply of fresh bread, a real treat after weeks of hardtack. With careful care, that simple mix of flour, water, and patience kept everyone looking forward to the next meal. Before refrigeration, cowboys and pioneers had to get creative to keep their food from spoiling, and pickling was one of their favorite tricks. The secret? Vinegar. That strong, acidic liquid created an environment where bacteria couldn't grow, so food stayed safe to eat much longer. Pickled cucumbers were probably the most common, but people also pickled peppers, melons, nuts, and even flowers like marigolds. Pickling was especially important because it gave travelers some vegetable options even after they'd been on the trail for weeks. Eating fresh fruits and vegetables was rare on long trips, so the tangy pickled stuff wasn't just tasty, it was also a way to stay healthier. The acids in vinegar help preserve some of the vitamins that would otherwise disappear and also help prevent diseases like scurvy. Even though the flavors were sharp and sometimes an acquired taste, pickled foods were a smart way to stretch food supplies on the trail and keep everyone feeling better. And on a long cattle drive, water was life. Chuck wagons carried big barrels strapped to the sides, but those barrels could only hold so much. The refills weren't always easy to find. Every drop had to count. Drinking water was top priority. Whatever was left went toward cooking and maybe a bit of washing up. Water wasn't always clean. Rivers and streams could hide germs that would make you sick. Cowboys boiled water when they could, but fuel was also precious, so sometimes they had to make hard decisions. Balancing the need to stay hydrated against the need to save fuel was a daily challenge. But long before ice boxes or refrigeration, keeping food at a safe temperature was a constant struggle. Bacteria grow best between 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 140 degrees Fahrenheit, so cowboys and cooks had to use whatever tricks they could. On the trail, they relied on timing, using up food that spoiled quickly first and saving harder, preserved items for later. When they camped, they took advantage of whatever natural cool spots they could find, digging holes, using caves, or stashing food in root cellars if they happened to pass one. On the trail, though, there wasn't much of that luxury, so careful planning was key. Cooks were always rotating supplies so that nothing was wasted and everyone stayed safe and well fed. But he wasn't just good with a skillet. He was a master of making do. On long drives, supplies ran low fast, but the cook knew how to stretch what he had. If the crew passed a farmhouse, he might trade a steer or barter for fresh eggs, vegetables, or even a sack of flour, whatever he could get to spice up the meals. No matter how thin the pantry got, one thing never changed. The coffee pot was always on. Cowboys drank it hot and black, calling it six-shooter coffee because it was strong enough to float a revolver. For staples like coffee, flour, and sugar, cooks relied on airtight containers to keep pests and moisture out. Canvas possum bellies slung under the wagon held firewood so they'd always have fuel to cook. Every detail of the wagon was about making sure they could keep food safe, clean, and ready to feed a hungry crew, even hundreds of miles from the nearest town. When we picture a cowboy on a cattle drive, we often imagine him on horseback. But one of the most important people on the trail never even sat in a saddle: the chuck wagon cook, or simply Cookie. In fact, they were paid nearly as much as the trail boss because everyone knew how much a good cook mattered. Cookies were often former cowboys who could no longer do the hard riding. Even though they couldn't chase cattle anymore, they had years of trail knowledge and experience. That came in handy because the cook's responsibilities went way beyond making meals. Injuries and sickness were common on long drives, so cowboys trusted the cook to patch up wounds, pull teeth, and keep everyone going. Sure, Cookie could be grumpy and have a sharp tongue, and the cowboys had their own nicknames for him: Bean Wrangler, Pot Wrestler, and if they were feeling bold, Belly Cheater. They never dared to say it to his face. In his presence, he was always Cookie. He wasn't just the guy who cooked the beans and biscuits. Cookie was the glue that held the crew together. He was the camp doctor, barber, vet, and even the peacemaker when fights broke out. And if anyone outside the crew insulted him, the cowboys would stand by him like family, because Cookie was family, the heart of the camp, second only to the trail boss. And after a long day of cooking and cleaning up, Cookie had one last job: setting up the wagon tongue so it pointed toward the North Star. That way, everyone had a quick guide to start off in the right direction the next morning. More than anything, the cook's skill kept morale high. A tasty dinner and a hot cup of coffee could turn a terrible day into a bearable one. But if the food was bad or spoiled, tempers ran short and the entire drive could go off track. Cookie's meals weren't just fuel, they were the glue that held them together. As railroads expanded across the country, cattle drives became a thing of the past. Cows were shipped by train, and the chuck wagon slowly rolled into history. But the spirit of the chuck wagon still lives on. Rodeos, especially in Western Canada, feature exciting chuck wagon races. Across the U.S., there are cook-offs where modern-day cookies compete with old-style recipes. Some ranches even host chuck wagon dinners, giving guests a real taste of cowboy life. In many ways, the chuck wagon's a symbol of America's grit and creativity, a mobile kitchen that fed the people who helped shape the West. And here's the fun part: today's food trucks are modern chuck wagons. Even today, the spirit of the Old West lives on, and people like Kent Rollins are a big reason why. Kent is a living, breathing piece of cowboy history. Born near the Red River in Oklahoma, Kent grew up working cattle with his dad and learning the cowboy way of life. He got his start cooking in the wilds of New Mexico with his uncle, feeding hunters deep in the backcountry. In 1993, Kent bought a chuck wagon of his own and began cooking for real ranches. It didn't take long for people to take notice. By 1996, he was named the official chuck wagon cook of Oklahoma. Since then, Kent's been on TV shows like Throwdown with Bobby Flay, where he actually beat Bobby with chicken fried steak, Chopped Grill Masters, and Cutthroat Kitchen. But Kent's a storyteller too. He travels across the country sharing tales of the cowboy life, cracking jokes, and keeping the chuck wagon tradition alive. With his humor, charm, and down-home cooking, Kent Rollins reminds us that some old ways are still worth celebrating. So, what do you think? Could you survive months on the trail with just dried beans, salt pork, and a chuck wagon cook in charge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, give the video a like and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Next, you can either check out our recommended video on how cowboys survive sleeping out in the open Wild West ground, or pick the video YouTube thinks you'll love based on your personal interests. The choice is yours. Happy watching.